In 1995, game developers Westwood Studios released the first Command & Conquer, later renamed Tiberian Dawn, to universal acclaim. They followed it up the next year with a prequel/spin-off subtitled Red Alert, which in turn got a sequel in 2000. In between those first two Red Alerts, Electronic Arts acquired Westwood, and 2 years after Red Alert 2's expansion, Yuri's Revenge, EA dissolved the studio. However, EA continued to develop games in the popular Command & Conquer franchise, including 2008's Red Alert 3. To help promote the game, they also released two tie-in games in 2009. One is Command & Conquer Red Alert, an iOS exclusive, which is how we ended up with two games called Command & Conquer Red Alert. You may be tempted to call it Red Alert Mobile, but hey, not so fast, because the other promotional game I mentioned was Command & Conquer Red Alert Mobile. Join me as I play through these three games all called Command & Conquer Red Alert, and I'll highlight what makes each of them notable before deciding which deserves to keep its name and which ones are getting new titles. Let's find out which one comes out on top, as there can be only one Command & Conquer Red Alert. If you're not familiar with the Red Alert series, it actually does a pretty good job of introducing itself. Albert Einstein travels back in time to kill Hitler before his rise to power, and then returns to the present to find that the world is still at war, only now the aggressor is Stalin's Soviet Union. But oh no! Einstein's been captured by the Soviets, so we take command of elite operative Tanya Adams and start gunning down commies left and right while industrial rock music plays. And now you have a pretty good idea of what Red Alert's all about. The game features two campaigns for you to play, either as the Allies beating back the communist invaders, or as the Soviets conquering all of Europe. The two factions have access to different units and buildings, helping to make the campaign stand out as two different experiences. Red Alert is an early entry in the RTS genre, released only 4 years after the genre-defining Dune 2, which was also made by Westwood. If you're familiar with RTSs, you know the drill: establish a base, gather resources, build up an army, and get killing. Most of the game's missions play out like that, but a few are actually more thematic. For example, that first Allied mission doesn't involve any base building, just some free units and Tanya sent to a woefully unprepared enemy base to wreak havoc. The second mission has base building, and there is an enemy base to go blow up, but ultimately your goal is to protect a convoy of trucks that show up partway through the mission. So as long as they make it through safely, it doesn't actually matter whether or not you destroy the enemy base. Then the third mission has you sending Tanya to take on enemy soldiers, fortifications, and dogs. Dogs. Okay, so different RTSs go by different rules when it comes to units taking the initiative. In this game, I never quite figured out those rules. Most of the time, I'd issue the stop command to make all the units stop dead in their tracks, which usually would make them kill nearby enemies. Other times, I'd have to explicitly tell them to defend themselves. With Tanya, though, you have to click on the dogs. Even when she's given plenty of time to react to the dog coming her way, she refuses to shoot it unless you tell her. You have to click on the dogs. Dogs in Red Alert one-shot any infantry unit, so you have to click on the dogs. They're kind of small and very fast, so when you don't have the vision to see them coming for a while, it can be tricky to click on them in time, which, by the way, you have to do. This touches on what's probably my biggest gripe with RTSs. See, on paper, RTSs sound like a lot of fun to me. They have a lot of elements that I like: base building, resource management, death on an unfathomable scale, and they're frequently conceptually interesting, like Red Alert, for example. Why yes, I would like to command troops in an alternate history World War II against the Soviets, with just a sprinkling of weird Cold War sci-fi technology. But in practice, there's just too much going on for me to keep track of and control, and my brain short circuits and the game starts feeling tedious. Having to manage the movement and attacks of 2 or 3 different squads as they make their advance, while also having to manage the expansion and defense of 1 or 2 bases, is just way too much for me. See, RTSs just aren't well suited for human brains. You need a computer brain to appreciate them fully. One problem that I had throughout my time with Red Alert is that the objectives can be kind of ambiguous. Tanya's been captured, and I need to rescue her. Okay, how do I do that? Get spy into War Factory. Alright. What's a War Factory? And where is it? The game also doesn't tell you that the spy can't attack, but that in turn he's never attacked by enemies other than dogs. I can also only assume that he's meant to be British.
For king and country.
Before long, the "Get Spy into War Factory" message disappears, and it stays disappeared when loading a previous save. Is this a war factory? Oh, I guess not. Sorry, Tanya. I didn't read the manual, so I'm still figuring out what things are in the game. You might have already noticed that I don't have a mini-map yet. That's because you need to build the radar dome in order to even get the mini-map, and on top of that, if you ever use up more power than you're generating, you'll lose it. That could be absolutely devastating during a fight, but more than anything, the lack of minimap is just kind of annoying. Using the minimap is absolutely crucial both for information and, more importantly, for navigating the camera around the map. Speaking of which, you might have also noticed that the map starts entirely shrouded in black. Modern RTSs often have 3 states for vision. You have unexplored blackness, areas within vision, and areas that you've previously explored but don't currently have vision of, which is often called fog of war. Well, Red Alert doesn't have fog of war. Once you explore part of the map, it's fully revealed for good. You don't need to keep units or buildings around to keep an eye on enemy actions. Most of the game's missions ultimately boil down to basic skirmish rules, meaning you complete the mission by killing the enemy. In Red Alert, the victory condition for killing the enemy requires that you kill every single one of their units and buildings. Even if the enemy has no units left and the only remaining buildings are, say, power generators or mineral stores, meaning they literally have no way of producing anything that could deal damage, you still have to wipe out every last building. As a result, most missions end with me anticlimactically scrambling around to find the final building or unit I need to kill to make the mission end, even though I had decisively won already. Luckily, you eventually get access to the Tech Center building, which reveals the entire map 4 minutes after its construction, making it much easier to find the stragglers. Soon enough, the game introduces naval combat to the mix. I wouldn't say I'm a fan, and it's kind of a problem I have with the naval combat of maybe every single strategy game I've ever played. What's going on with the naval combat in a given match doesn't really interact with what's going on the ground in any kind of interesting way. Unless you need to cross a body of water to get to the enemy base, you can just entirely ignore the enemy's navy and be just fine. They're not going to be a problem or pose any particular threat to your base directly. Now, if you do need to cross a body of water to get to the enemy, then you need to load your troops into transports, a measly 5 units at a time. And here, naval dominance does matter, because if you can destroy the transports before they land, you just neutralized the entire enemy army. But the naval units don't actually present a new avenue for victory, because like I said, they're not posing any real threat to bases, and they don't really interact with the existing ground combat at all. So you can't use naval combat to outmaneuver, outplay, or outstrategize your opponent. At best, you can only use it to grind the game to a halt and force an unsatisfying impasse. Anyway, it's not actually that bad in the Red Alert campaign. Mostly, the enemy navy is just annoying, and the biggest impact they have on any given mission is when you have to hunt down the stragglers at the end. Well, if missions are almost entirely decided by what goes on the ground, let's talk about what's on offer there. One thing I definitely like about this game is that they expect you to just churn out soldiers in massive numbers. They're fairly inexpensive and they train up fast, so you can get a real big clump of them nice and quick if you want. If you've played a fair number of strategy games, you may be familiar with the rock, paper, scissors principle when it comes to designing unit strengths and weaknesses. For example, a game may have archers who can effectively take down infantry, cavalry that can charge in and annihilate archers, and then infantry who can bog down and defeat the cavalry units. This kind of setup usually makes you think a little more about your army's composition and about your positioning of different types of units. Well, in Red Alert, you have your standard infantry right here. They're good at killing other infantry. There's also dogs, who are infantry that are even better at killing other infantry. The Allies get defensive pillboxes that are excellent at mowing down infantry, and Soviets get a fire turret that takes out entire clumps of troops at a time. If you come across vehicles, you'll find that dogs literally cannot attack them, and your regular firearms aren't that effective. But if you bring some rocket troops along, they'll do just fine against vehicles, except that the rockets are then ineffective against infantry. Hey, that sounds a bit rock, paper, scissory. Well, it's not. This isn't a game of rock versus paper versus scissors. No, this is a game of rock versus tank. Tank wins. Even though they're several times more expensive, you want tanks. You know what happens when you shoot a tank? Not much. You know what happens when a tank steps on you? You turn into paste. If you have a dozen soldiers up against a tank, the tank's gonna win, plain and simple. Even if all those soldiers are rocket troopers, the tank's just gonna literally roll right over them. A pack of hostile dogs is the harbinger of the apocalypse for infantry, But to tanks, they're just scenery. Tanks don't even care about pillboxes or fire turrets, and unlike infantry, tanks do decent damage against buildings and they have a good amount of health. So tanks are good against tanks, excellent against infantry, invincible to dogs, effective against buildings, resistant to base defenses, and as the cherry on top, they can plow through wire fences that block infantry. Infantry just doesn't hold up. Tanks get the job done. So I developed my strategy pretty quickly playing this game, and that strategy was tanks. At first, I was kind of struggling with this game. Even on the easiest difficulty, the Soviets could put up some real resistance. Some missions were much harder than others, though. This mission is an absolute nightmare. Thematically, it's quite interesting, and actually a nice departure from the usual RTS fare. In the previous mission, we were assaulting a base built up around Stalin's nuclear control bunker, and in a desperate bid, he ordered 4 nukes to be launched right before we took control. So in this mission, you command a group of infantry, medics, engineers, and spies to go in and disable the nukes before they land. The idea is that you use the spies to explore the base relatively safely, so that you can determine the locations of the nuclear terminals and what the safest routes are. Once you've scouted ahead, you use your limited number of troops to clear the routes so that the defenseless engineers can get to the terminals. But there are 2 factors at play here that make this mission probably the hardest one in the whole game. First of all, you're on a timer. As you can see, the in-game clock does run a little fast, but it also doesn't really matter because the limit here is unit movement speed and time to kill, not how quickly you can make decisions. Second of all, what you see is what you get. When a troop dies, you can't just replace them. So if you make the wrong turn and half your soldiers get taken out by a grenade, that's not something you can actually recover from. On top of that, while the spy's only use here is to scout ahead, there are plenty of dogs, so it's never actually totally safe to do that. Fortunately, Tanya makes a guest appearance in this level, but the game never gives you any indication that you should even go look for her. She only spawns when you reach this room. Once she shows up, the level becomes a lot safer because she can gun down infantry with no effort, but you still have to watch out for the dogs. Even after liberally quick saving and quick loading to get optimal outcomes, and after having already restarted the entire level once I learned the layout and the approximate enemy locations, I finished with barely any time left. I seriously doubt anyone has ever beaten this level on their first attempt. There's a similar level later on that I found much more interesting and fun, and while it's also on a timer, the time there is much more lenient. As for the standard missions, my usual strategy was to play defensively at first while amassing a suitably large tank battalion, and then I'd send them in to steamroll through the enemy base. And it worked great until I came up against this base. This one was causing me problems. The Tesla coils cut through my tanks like a hot knife through butter, and the flame turrets annihilated my infantry like hot napalm on humans. Trying to attack the Tesla coils directly wouldn't work too well because I'd have to blast through the concrete walls first, and they're pretty darn sturdy. Things were bad. Eventually, I built up a large force and decided to just run past the Tesla coils to try and take the base out from further back, but that didn't go so well, and then I was broke and had no units. One interesting feature of this game's campaign is that a lot of the missions have multiple variants of their maps. The story and the objectives are exactly the same, and the structure of the maps are similar, but they're laid out slightly differently. So I retried this mission on the other variant, and I went with a different strategy. Rather than building up a steamroller army, I just crushed them ASAP with the smallest army I think would still be effective. It took a little trial and error and plenty of suicidal waves of tanks, but in the end, I managed to effectively nip this base in the bud, destroying its barracks and war factory before it can make a proper army. Overall, I found this Soviet campaign far easier. I think that boiled down to 2 main differences between the factions. First of all, Soviet tanks are just straight up better. Look at this, the best tank the Allies can muster is a medium tank. Medium! Soviets start off at heavy tanks and later bump up to mammoth. Now we're talking. Mammoth tanks really can do it all. They come equipped with anti-air missiles, and they're so effective at shooting infantry that you don't even need to bother running them over anymore. The second difference is that Allies don't have anything remotely comparable to the Tesla coil. They do get anti-tank turrets, but they're terrible. They're basically just a stationary tank. This meant that the early rush strategy that I used for that one Allied mission became my bread and butter for the whole Soviet campaign. Most of the missions were effectively over in the first 15 minutes or so, as the People's Armor would come in and level the Allied base before they even got their footing. Then I'd usually have to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes just looking around for the final stragglers so I could kill them and complete the mission. Remember how I said you can reveal the whole map with the tech building? Well, that's Allies only. Soviets only get access to a spy plane, which can reveal small areas of the map one at a time after a cooldown. As a result, finding the stragglers was a lot more annoying as Soviets. One mechanic I haven't mentioned yet is that you can recruit engineers who can convert enemy buildings to your side if the building is damaged enough. It's especially powerful to use on enemy construction yards, as that allows you to have a forward base, but engineer conversion can also grant access to the other faction's units and abilities. I think this is a super cool mechanic, and I wish this was more common in asymmetric strategy games. Occasionally, I would use this to reveal the map as Soviets, but usually getting an engineer over to the building was more trouble than it was worth. Let's see, what else is there to say about this game? Well, those of you who are familiar with Red Alert, or with the year 1996, will know that I've been lying to you this whole time. The game I've been showing you isn't actually Red Alert. Yeah, I pulled a Trackmania original on you again. What I'm showing you here is actually the remaster of Red Alert, or more precisely, it's the Command & Conquer Remaster Collection, which contains remasters of Red Alert and the original Command & Conquer. The remaster has upscaled cutscenes, improved UI and controls, remastered music, a more usable minimap, and completely new graphics. Look, they even let you toggle the visuals at will. I love it when remasters do that. It's cool how the new visuals still match the poses and designs of the original art, really making it feel like an update to the graphics instead of a replacement. They did a great job with it. Anyway, here's the actual original Red Alert. Well, not exactly. Since we're revisiting a game from 1996, I think it's worth mentioning that it didn't look like this back then. I don't mean that the game's visuals were updated or anything. I mean display hardware has changed so much that even though the software is sending the same instructions to the monitor ends up displaying something very different. I mean, first of all, I'm scaling the resolution up. It's running at an impressive 640 by 400 pixels, which is this big. But I'm not just talking about a difference in resolution or pixel size. See, a lot of people think of pixel art as a retro style because old games used pixel art, but old games' pixel art back then didn't look like what pixel art looks like right now. CRT monitors were the standard back in the day, and household monitors only started switching over to flat panel displays around 2005. Pixel art of the time was made on and for CRT monitors, and as you can see, they'd look very different. I picked these particular examples because I think they look great as modern pixel art, but they also show how stark the difference is between the crisp pixels that we're used to and the blur from the CRTs that implies so much more detail. Anyway, back to Red Alert, most of the non-aesthetic changes in the remaster are pretty minor. Probably the two biggest are both in the sidebar. The original game's sidebar has 2 columns, buildings and units, and only 4 of each are displayed at a time. To actually build or recruit the thing that you want, you have to sit there and click the scroll arrow until you find it. In the remaster, you'll still have to scroll if you unlock too many options, but everything is split into 4 different tabs, making it much easier to find what you want. It's going to be pretty familiar if you've played other Command & Conquer games. The other big change is that the remaster lets you queue up unit recruitments. That might sound like a small thing, but it is not. It drastically improves how the game plays.
In progress. On hold. Cancel. Preparing.
I mentioned that the remastered game also includes remastered music, and you've gotten a taste of it already, but I want to make something absolutely clear. The music composed by Frank Klepacki for the Command & Conquer franchise is some of the greatest video game music in history. Track for track, I think Red Alert 2 might be the single best OST of all time, but Red Alert 1's soundtrack is also incredible. Unfortunately, it's kind of difficult to show you how great it is. First of all, the soundtrack is so chock full of winners that it's hard to pick only a few to demonstrate how good it is as a whole. We're spoiled for choice. On top of that, each song has a fair bit of variety within itself, introducing new sounds, instruments, and motifs on a whim. Take the song Mud for example. It starts sounding like this. A couple minutes later, it sounds like this. And then a couple minutes after that, it introduces its most memorable sound just for the very end. Remember the theme song, Hell March? Well, the second half of that song sounds like this. I think this kind of variety within each song is a fantastic choice for video game music, because each song sounds cohesive, but has enough texture in it to keep playing for a while without sounding repetitive or annoying. But in turn, it means there's no good part I can single out to present to you, because the songs are just long chains of different sounding good parts. This game's soundtrack is so good that even the song that was relegated to only playing over the credits is awesome. And it's not just high energy action tracks, the game also has some more mellow songs that are just as excellent. Overall, the soundtrack to Red Alert is thematic, and it suits the gameplay perfectly, and the songs still work great even outside the context of the game. I highly recommend listening through the remastered soundtrack in your own time. Red Alert has one last big surprise for us before we're done. Like I had mentioned earlier, EA eventually acquired the Command & Conquer IP and developed Red Alert 3. Well, in addition to those two mobile games, they also used the original Red Alert as promotional material, making it entirely free. So if you want to give Red Alert a try, you're in luck. But the real big surprise is that upon releasing the Command & Conquer Remastered Collection, EA also made the game's source code freely available under a copyleft license. Now that's a surprise. Now, to be clear, you can't just take the code, wave a wand, and have the playable remastered games, because the engine code isn't present and it doesn't have any art or sound assets. But the code is still useful in other ways, like how the fan wiki uses the game's actual source code as a citation when it describes specific mechanics. If you're dead set on playing Red Alert for free with modern quality of life features, well, you're still in luck, because the community has been hard at work reverse engineering the game's engine for over a decade now, and because the original game is free, they can use the game's assets no problem. So while you can't play the remaster for free, you can get a pretty comparable experience for free with OpenRA, and OpenRA has benefited from having direct public access to the original game's source code. This is what everybody wins looks like. Game developers, like the developers of OpenRA, can look at and even directly reuse source code from a tried and tested, adored video game, so devs don't have to reinvent the wheel if they want to find what makes the game tick. Consumers like you and me have tons of options, including being able to play a high-quality version of the entire game for free. And EA also comes out on top, because even though there are multiple ways to play Red Alert and the original Command & Conquer for free, the Remastered Collection has done very well, and it's not exactly cheap for a couple of games that are 2.5 decades old. On top of all of that, modding the Remastered Collection is super easy because of the availability of the source code, and once again, that's a situation where everybody wins. I think that releasing code to the public should basically be the standard for games, and that goes triple for games from massive studios like EA. The success of the Remastered Collection only solidifies that view for me. So, what to make of Red Alert? Well, to be honest with you, I was looking forward to playing it because I had played so much of Red Alert 2 and Red Alert 3 back in the day. But the game gave me quite a bit of resistance at first. and I had to quick save and quick load constantly to make any progress. It seems to me that the balance is completely out of whack and it heavily favors the Soviets. Some mechanics fell kinda flat. I'd already talked about the naval combat, but I hadn't even mentioned that the two factions each have their own super weapon. The problem is that these super weapons aren't even particularly useful, much less super, and I did just fine by outright ignoring them. But while I wasn't hooked by the game immediately, I found myself warming up to it in the later Allied missions, and I was having a great time by the end of the Soviet missions. I'm definitely looking forward to playing through the expansions. For me, what really stands out about Red Alert, looking back, is how simple it is compared to most RTSs I've played. You don't have worker units, you just have a build queue. Individual units don't get abilities that you have to tell them to cast, all they do is move and attack. There aren't multiple resources you have to spend on units and buildings, it's just money, and there's no fog of war. Given that I find the core gameplay of an RTS kind of overwhelming, the relative simplicity of Red Alert is actually really refreshing. Okay, so unfortunately, before I can even get started talking about the game, there's a lot of other stuff I need to get out of the way first. This is a game made for Apple devices, specifically iOS 3, which was released back in 2009, and a little bit of time has passed since then. EA continued to support the game through to iOS 7, but when iOS 8 was released in 2013, EA decided to pull the app from the App Store rather than update it to work on the newer OS. You know how some older games on Steam have a warning telling you that they're not compatible with new operating systems? Well, if Steam took Apple's approach, those games would be removed not just from the store, but from people's Steam libraries, even if they had already purchased and previously played the game. As it is, there are quite a few games that have been removed from Steam's store for a variety of reasons, but as far as I can tell, there have only been a handful of games that were removed from people's libraries, and it looks like it's only games that either violated Steam's terms of service, or games that were permanently destroyed by their developers anyway. But to really fit the analogy with Apple's App Store, Steam would have to be the only practical way to obtain any games at all, and even if you managed to find a cracked copy online, the only way to run it would be to do some hacky stuff with your PC that voids its warranty. So in a normal world, EA's taking the game off the App Store only 4 years after its release would be recognized as a really extreme move, but we're not in a normal world. This is Apple's world. In Apple's world, the current generation of devices, operating systems, and hardware only exists to get you interested in the next generation of Apple's products. If you're not constantly updating and upgrading, you're not throwing your money Apple's way, and they can't have that. So they intentionally break compatibility to the point that software that's only 4 years old stops working entirely, and they will happily destroy perfectly fine software just because it isn't updating frequently enough. In 2022, Apple decided to cull apps from the App Store that hadn't received an update within an arbitrary, ambiguous amount of time. Some of their targets were games that were only a few years old at that point. What's more is that Apple has taken what's commonly referred to as the walled garden approach to its software and hardware. That refers to how difficult it is to develop and distribute custom software and hardware for Apple devices. If you want to hack together a weird new game controller in your garage, you can just plug that into your Windows or Linux PC and it'll work no problem. Try to do that with an Apple device, and you'll run into obstacle after obstacle, if it's even possible at all. If you want to develop new software or download somebody else's software off the internet on a Windows or Linux PC, it's trivially easy to do so. Apple devices, on the other hand, have tons of engineering in them to specifically prevent you from being able to do that. The point being that removing an app from the App Store is going to practically annihilate that app. I just got finished playing through Red Alert, which was a game that didn't receive an update for over 20 years. But if it were up to Apple, that game would have been virtually deleted from existence before it even got a sequel. Apple's walled garden approach is like all the worst parts of DRM, but unlike DRM, it's not even ostensibly about preventing piracy. It's restriction just for the sake of restriction. Luckily, I managed to find somebody's archive of a bunch of old iOS games that were removed from the App Store, and the iOS Red Alert was on there. But in order to actually play it, you have to run the old iOS version. And in order to run the old iOS version, you actually need old Apple hardware. This is the real coup de grace of Apple's walled garden. I want to play an old game, so I need to run an old OS, which needs an old iPod. As soon as that old hardware becomes scarce, these games are done for. And because of how iOS is engineered, emulators literally don't exist. As a result, there's an enormous catalog of games out there that are already extremely scarce, and likely quite a lot that are already permanently lost, all because of Apple's walled garden. On top of all of that, because the walled garden is so restrictive and is designed to limit your ownership rights, people who actually like archival preservation and ownership are going to avoid Apple products and gravitate towards platforms that actually respect your ownership, even if they only do so begrudgingly. As a result, the odds that there's somebody out there even bothering to archive apps for Apple products are pretty slim. Anyway, I knew I wanted to play this game for the video, so that means I had to get an old iPod. I managed to get a 4th gen iPod Touch off eBay for a pretty decent price. Now maybe you're thinking, okay, you've got the game and you've got the requisite hardware, time to start playing. Slow down there, buddy. This is Apple's world, so you need Apple's permission. Even if you manage to get the app's files onto the iPod won't run it because the app needs to be authenticated. And this is an app that hasn't been on the App Store for a decade, so it is definitely no longer authenticated. That's what jailbreaking is for. Basically, you're no longer restricted to just what's available on the App Store, and apps can potentially gain access to more functionality on an iPod's hardware. Naturally, being able to actually use your iPod is strictly against Apple's EULA, but the bottom line is that I can indeed now play the game. My next problem was how to record the footage. I'm pretty sure modern iOS devices have native screen capture capability, but iOS 6 certainly doesn't, so I went looking for an app. Apparently, someone made a high-quality app called Display Recorder, and it's available on Cydia, which is the main source for jailbroken apps. But Display Recorder is a premium app costing $5, which normally wouldn't be too big a deal, except that Cydia's payment system shut down 5 years ago. So now it's impossible to access paid-only apps on Cydia. Ugh. There was another unrelated app, also called Display Recorder, that was on the official App Store at the time, but when I used that, the game lagged all to hell and the recording was abysmally low frame rate. Finally, there's an app called Record My Screen, which is free and open source, but it crashed every time I tried to use it. Honestly, I felt like I ran out of options. I guess I could have recorded the iPod with another camera, which doesn't look great. I think there's also a way to plug the iPod into an HDMI monitor, which would mean that I could get a capture card in between to collect the footage. Except capture cards aren't really cheap, and there's no guarantee that that's even a supported feature for this generation of iPod Touches, because Apple is really unclear about what features of theirs work for which devices. Luckily, I managed to find an old version of Record My Screen, and that one didn't crash. It's worth noting that downpatching is also something you normally can't do on Apple devices. Anyway, there's still some caveats. First of all, the footage is pretty choppy. The game starts to stutter noticeably while the iPod is recording, but on top of that, the recorded video itself is even choppier than what I was seeing while playing. Second of all, there isn't any audio in the recordings. As far as I can tell, recording the audio of the iPod is literally impossible. Not one of the 3 recording apps that I found actually recorded the audio. iPods do have an audio jack for earbuds, so I could pipe it someplace to record it that way, similar to the capture card, but recording the screen while playing also breaks the audio of the game completely. Music doesn't play at all, and various voice lines and sound effects only play partially and loop incorrectly. But honestly, I think this is basically as good as it's gonna get. I am really twisting and pushing the iPod to do things that Apple very explicitly tried to make impossible, so I feel like janky audio and stuttery video is a small price to pay. Especially because you're not really missing much by losing the audio. There are only 2 songs in the whole game, and they're both from Red Alert 3. Hell March 3 in the main menu, which sounds like this. And Red Rock for Mother Russia Everywhere Else, which sounds like this. In my opinion, Red Alert 3's soundtrack is okay, but reducing it to 2 songs, only one of which actually plays during gameplay, makes it kind of unbearable. Right then, on to the game. As before, the game features 2 campaigns. You can play either as the Soviets getting their hands on time-traveling technology, or as the Allies frustrating the Soviets' time-traveling efforts. I'm pretty sure that makes the Soviet campaign a prelude to Red Alert 3's story. While playing as the Soviets, I learned a pretty familiar lesson. Infantry are worthless. It's all about tanks. Tanks can still run troops over, and they're still the best way to deal with base defenses. The first 2 missions are really straightforward, as they're mostly just there to introduce you to the game's basic mechanics. But those missions are teaching you how to run, and the 3rd mission expects you to fly. You need to get Natasha to the other side of the map, and there's an enormous Allied base blocking your path. The game informs you that luckily there's a lightly defended Allied post nearby that can give you an advantage if you destroy it. Lightly defended, my ass! Not only is it chock full of prism towers and tanks, but the Allies send wave after wave of attackers at your base. Now, Tesla coils will do a fine job of cleaning up the troops they send, but Allied tanks outrange the Tesla coils. The only way to defend yourself against them is to manually send units to attack them, and if you're sending infantry, they're just going to get mowed down. The problem is that making tanks is both time-consuming and pretty expensive, so it's incredibly difficult to use tanks to defend yourself from the Allied onslaught and still have enough left over to keep up the offensive pressure. Quite unlike the original game, the Soviet tanks here are not better than the Allied tanks. Actually, I'm pretty sure the Allied tanks are stronger, and not just because of their longer range. But Soviet tanks don't outrange Allied defensive turrets, and they don't even have more health or damage to compensate. It's rough. On top of that, the budget is really tight during this mission, and I usually didn't make money quickly enough to be able to afford to replace tanks or defensive turrets as they died. Even worse, the refineries in this game only have a limited amount of money that they can produce before permanently expiring, so you're very much on the clock here to clear the outpost before running out of money. After many restarts, I finally managed to wipe out the outpost, which alleviated a lot of the pressure. But the main Allied base was still sending out waves of tanks, so defense was still going to be a problem, and I still had to get Natasha into position. Well, despite my best efforts to keep her safe, a dog got through my defenses and instantly killed her. Unlike the original Red Alert, I can't save my progress partway through a mission. The moment the game over pop-up appeared, I was boned, and my only option was to restart the entire mission. Oh god, why? So I retried it over and over, and eventually I managed to wipe out the outpost again, and now I was extra careful with Natasha, and finally, I beat this mission. Honestly, that was way harder than anything the original Red Alert threw at me, except for maybe that nuclear bunker. Now would be a good time to talk about the controls. Like I said, this game came out in 2009, which means that it's actually a very early entry of the modern mobile game. For reference, that was the year that iPods and iPhones first got the ability to record video with their camera app, and the iPad didn't even exist yet. Apple only first implemented in-app purchases in the App Store earlier that year, and Angry Birds only first came out right at the end of that year. And even by 2010, only 20% of the US population used smartphones, compared to about 80% nowadays. So this is by no means the first, but it's definitely an early pioneer of what we usually think of as mobile games nowadays. Fortunately, they seem to have already basically figured out how the game should control. It's not that surprising that the game controls well though, because in my opinion, strategy is one of the most ripe game genres out there for implementing touchscreen controls. Really, any game that is played exclusively with the mouse would probably be a straight up better experience on a suitably large touchscreen. But that's the problem here. The screen isn't big enough. I remember back in the day, the RTS game Ruse released a trailer that featured 2 players controlling their units on the same enormous touchscreen table. And then apparently at E3 that year, you could go play a demo of Ruse on a massive touchscreen. In my opinion, they probably should have stuck to a more top-down view, but I think you can see the potential here. It's like the digital equivalent of generals shoving pieces around a map in a war room, which is exactly how I want to feel playing an RTS. Anyway, the 4th generation iPod Touch is not the size of a table. See? So, for example, trying to move to a specific location on the minimap is really difficult because the darn thing is just so small. The other major problem this game has is that the pathfinding is legitimately awful. For the final mission of the Soviet campaign, you're tasked with defending the time machine for 10 minutes while the Allies sent everything they've got at you to destroy it. This mission was rough. As I'm sure you'd guessed by now, my strategy was to pump out loads and loads and loads of tanks. Rather than taking the offensive, I figured my best bet was to just slow down the Allied advance as much as possible. After all, I didn't need to eliminate the Allied base, I just needed to hold out for 10 minutes. I was able to hold my ground decently well for about 6 minutes, at which point all my refineries ran out of money. So that was it. The money I had was all I was gonna get. It then became something of a mad dash to sell buildings before the Allies destroyed them, so that I could scrape something together for the last stand, so the first line of defense had officially fallen. Thankfully, the poor pathfinding works both ways. By the time the Allied tanks found their way to my base, I only needed less than a minute. My few remaining tanks did not last long at all against the horde of superior Allied armor, but their sacrifice was not in vain. Mission complete! Psych! It turns out that I did actually have to wipe out the Allied base, even though I had no units and no money. I thought for sure I'd have to restart, but luckily I was authorized to launch missiles all over the place. I still had to be extremely careful to destroy the oncoming waves of Allies in time, because I had no idea what the failure condition was, and I didn't want to find out. So the first few missiles launched were just cleaning up the Allied forces that were already ravaging my base from earlier. Oh look, I still had a leftover tank! No, actually they all died in the Allied attack. Anyway, once the incoming waves had become more stable and regular, I'd alternate between dropping a bomb on the incoming hostiles and dropping a bomb on their base. In the end, even with only $5 to my name, I became a Soviet hero. By comparison, the Allied campaign is a walk in the park. Like I already mentioned, they have better tanks, but also their missions were just much easier. I'm pretty sure Tanya is also objectively superior to Natasha. And the Allied finale was really underwhelming. You start surrounded by 3 Soviet bases, and you don't have a single refinery, but the game informs you that only one of the enemy bases has any refineries, and that you should go take them for yourself. That base is very poorly defended, not least because the Allied tanks outrange the Tesla coils, so taking the refineries for yourself is a breeze. Once you do that, it just becomes a matter of time before the Soviets run out of money and literally can't produce any more units. The mission practically plays itself. Outside of the campaign, you can do one-on-one skirmishes against a bot or another player. There are only 2 maps though. I hadn't mentioned it yet, but even without its expansions, the original Red Alert had 24 different maps and up to 8 players in a match. What's particularly interesting about the multiplayer here though, is that it's either played over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and not through a centralized server. That's right, the multiplayer component of Red Alert for the iOS passes the Rip Van Winkle test. It'll always work. Huh. One thing that sets Red Alert 3 apart from its predecessors is that it introduces a third faction, the Empire of the Rising Sun. You can unlock that faction in this game too as an in-app purchase, so let's go get it. Oh right, of course. This game is no longer on the App Store, and EA has long since abandoned support for buying its in-app purchases. At one point, EA re-released the game for the iPad, and that was bundled with the Empire of the Rising Sun faction, but that doesn't do us any good here because I don't have an iPad. At any rate, this game originally cost $1, and the iPad re-release cost $3, but once they were taken off the App Store, it didn't actually matter that you paid money for the product. It was no longer available to you unless you kept it installed on your device and didn't update your device's OS. So, what to make of Red Alert? Well, there was so much crap to wade through to even get to the point where I could play it in the first place, and that basically disqualifies it from being a game that I would ever recommend to anybody. That said, even with the weird camera angle and terrible pathfinding, I still enjoyed playing, almost exclusively because of the touchscreen controls. So it's janky, extremely light on content, and disqualifyingly inaccessible, but it does do a good job of showing the potential of touchscreen RTSs. Alright, now we're talking. A mobile game for real phones. Predictably, I'm running an emulator to play this game because I don't actually own the right kind of phone. But I tried to figure out which device I'm specifically emulating, and I'm pretty sure it's this bad boy right here. So that's the tech we're dealing with. It turns out that the best emulators for this environment are actually on Android rather than on PC, Which kind of makes sense because Android is a mobile platform built to run Java applications, and the mobile games for these old phones were made with Java. Plus, it provides a nice immersive experience playing this game on a phone's touchscreen just like the devs intended. By the way, I hope you like that MIDI rendition of Hell March 3. I know I did, the first time I heard it. Honestly, I think MIDI songs are really charming, and I think they can sound really good if they're used properly. Unfortunately, this song is just a 20-second loop. The only other track in the game is, whatever this is. It doesn't sound like any of the songs in Red Alert 3 to me. When I first heard it, it was playing on my phone's speakers, and I just assumed it was some kind of audio glitch from the emulation, because I could only hear the percussion, which I interpreted as gunfire and explosion sounds being incorrectly played. Anyway, this track is a 30-second loop. During gameplay, whenever any fighting starts, Hell March 3 kicks in, and when the fighting stops, it's back to the ambient strings and weird percussion. When you launch the game, it helpfully asks if you want to enable sound. Yeah, that's gonna be a no from me, I think. Well, I'm sure you know the drill by now. There's 2 campaigns, but this time around you have to progress a couple missions into the Soviet campaign to unlock the Allied one. The first mission has us commanding Natasha as she frees some captured comrades and attacks an Allied base. Wait, I've done this already. Look, just like in the iOS version, she gets surrounded by Allied troops and is rescued by Soviet tanks splattering them. So narratively, this game covers the same events as the iOS game, but the missions and the maps are still different. Like, even the layout of this first map is pretty different from the iOS game, even though the narrative and the objectives are the same. Once we get to the Allied campaign, several of the missions become carbon copies from the iOS game. This Allied mission is almost exactly the same, where Tanya is tasked with getting documents related to the time machine and then has to escape across a bridge that gets blown up by an engineer. And I'm sure you remember this one with the 3 Soviet bases and only 1 set of refineries. A lot of the dialogue and even several mission briefs are identical across both games, but overall, there are a lot more differences than similarities. Most missions in this game have no equivalent in the iOS version. There are 15 missions total, whereas the iOS game had only 10, and there's a lot more dialogue throughout. Speaking of which, the writing in this game is a bit off. I'm not really sure how to describe it or how to name it. If you're familiar with the style, you'll recognize it instantly. Like, look, after wiping out a large Soviet base, Soviet reinforcements show up and say, "We're here, comrades. We've come to help you against the Allied invaders. Hey, what are those clouds?" And they promptly get hit by the Allied weather control superweapon. One Soviet trooper survives and remarks, "I'm alive? Oh my god, I'm so lucky I'm alive! I am alive!" At which point an Allied bomber comes in and kills them. In one of the missions as the Soviets, we're given command of 10 bears tasked with killing Allied patrols, and in the mission brief, Natasha and Bronislav trade bear puns. Then in the intro cutscene, we see an Allied soldier walk off to some bushes to relieve himself, and he remarks, "Ah, this'll do nicely," right before being mauled to death by a surprise bear. Oh, name drop. Nice. Probably the best example of this game's humor comes right at the end. We've won the day and defeated the Soviets, so Tanya decides to get drunk with some soldiers. I think they're getting drunk anyway. They just say they're celebrating by looting the Soviet provisions. Is this supposed to be a joke about vodka? Anyway, she said she had too many provisions and needs a moment, which prompts one soldier to suggest that they do their celebration dance to help cheer her up and make her feel better. So they all start dancing. That's not funny, right? I mean, I can imagine a 6-year-old finding this absolutely hilarious, but to me it barely even registers as a joke. To be clear, I'm not complaining at all. I find this game's tone strangely endearing, and it absolutely made me like the game a lot more. In terms of gameplay, Red Alert Mobile takes a few significant departures from the other games. First of all, you can't select individual units at all. When you recruit a unit, you assign them to either the green squad or the gold squad, and then you can toggle between commanding the two squads. When you recruit a new unit, it automatically paths over to its squad. I'm sure this was set up to accommodate the limitations of the hardware and input, but it's actually pretty nice. Even in the original Red Alert, it was rare for me to make more than 3 or 4 control groups at a time. Secondly, recruiting a new unit is instant. I'm not so sure why they did this, but I still don't really mind it. It means I can pump out the tanks a lot faster, that's for sure. Lastly, there aren't any air units. Instead, they're represented by a bombing ability that you can just cast on cooldown. Once again, I actually really like this, because that was basically how air units worked in the original Red Alert anyway, it's just more streamlined here. Also, the other games would require complete annihilation of every enemy unit and building, but in this game, you just need to take out the enemy construction yard to win, completely eliminating the anticlimactic straggler hunt at the end of missions. But it's not all good news. The controls in this game are kind of terrible. First of all, while you do get a minimap if you have your faction's airport equivalent, you can't actually use it to move the camera, and there's no way to snap your camera to your current squad. And all that makes the camera movement a lot more tedious than it needs to be. Interacting with the UI using the touchscreen was super inconsistent, so I resorted to using the simulated physical buttons for navigating the build menu, but for some reason the only way to switch tabs is with the touchscreen, and you have to swipe it to the right to get to the next tab, and there's no way to go to the previous tab. Ordering a squad to move or attack requires double tapping for some reason, and even the slightest movement during a tap moves the camera, making it really hard to accurately double tap the same target. Even once a squad is given an order, it sometimes takes them a while to actually perform it. Oftentimes I just send a squad in and then not give them attack orders, because even though they'd be more effective if they focus the same target, I'd worried that they'd idle for so long between being given the command and actually attacking that it would be a net loss. Also, the pathfinding wasn't nearly as bad as the iOS game, but navigation would still sometimes be a bit weird. This mission, which is the Soviet finale, was especially rough. You have to get Natasha through an allied base without dying, and there's tons of units, tanks, and prism towers along the way. The units aren't much of a problem at all because Natasha outranges them and kills them in one shot, and the prism towers aren't much of an issue either because you can cut the power to disable them for 60 seconds, and that's plenty of time to get through the base. But if you catch a tank's attention, all you can do is run away and hope it de-aggroes before it kills you. The problem is, there are a few tanks you actually have to kill by attacking adjacent explosive barrels, and it can be really easy to accidentally navigate directly towards a tank. All it takes is one little slip up and Natasha dies and you have to restart the whole mission. Remember how I mentioned weird pathfinding? Watch Natasha here go the long way around to stand next to an explosive barrel that she's about to shoot. So I'm not even going to bother counting how many times I restarted the mission. It was a lot. But that's just the first part. Once Natasha reaches the other side, it's time to take on the allied base. One glance at the minimap will show you that, my base is a little smaller. The moment that you gain control, the allies already have 2 waves of enemies on your doorstep, and they are no joke. Allied paladin tanks give shields to nearby units, and guess what? Their prism tanks outrange the Tesla coils. You start with barely any money, and your construction yard is a stone's throw away from the attackers, so surprise surprise, I lost immediately. Which meant that I had to restart the entire mission and slog through Natasha's section again. Retry after retry after retry, and I got to the base and I instantly lost again! And again! Well, you know what they say, 4th time's the charm. I honestly think I managed to break the AI somehow, because this wave of allied tanks just kind of sat around instead of attacking, and there were a few times when attackers would retreat for no reason. Whatever, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, right? I rushed their tank production facility, and once it was down, the rest of the mission was a walk in the park. In retrospect, I figured that as long as I could fend off the first wave of attackers, I could probably win by bombing the enemy construction yard and then rushing it with tanks, popping the Iron Curtain ability on them to give them some extra shields. I don't actually know if that'd be enough to make them survive long enough to finish the job, but it would mean not actually having to deal with the rest of the base. In any case, I did end up finishing the mission, and it only took me over half an hour of repeated attempts. The brave stand of the Soviet forces against the Allied tides has bought some time for the scientists. The time machine is nearing completion, and the hour of the Soviet victory is at hand. Once again, the Allied campaign is a breeze compared to the Soviet one. The missions are generally a bit easier, and of course, those prism tanks are extremely strong. In fact, the more of them you clump together, the more damage they deal, and their attacks chain through multiple enemies, resulting in a lot of incidental kills. Also, the Allied bomber was just more useful than the Soviet blimps, and their chronosphere ability allows you to teleport units anywhere across the map, which is far more powerful than the temporary shielding from the Soviet Iron Curtain. The entire Allied campaign took me about as much time as that nightmarish Soviet finale. Outside of the campaign, you can do one-on-one skirmishes against an AI opponent on one of 4 maps, but unlike the iOS version, this game doesn't feature any multiplayer. So, what to make of Red Alert Mobile? Well, I really enjoyed the simpler, streamlined gameplay with the 2 squads and global abilities, and its off-kilter tone made the story way more enjoyable than a stale, generic war story that it could have just as easily had. But while I do think that RTSs and touchscreens are a winning combo, the controls in this particular game are awful, and it drags down the whole experience. Well, there we have it. We've seen what the Red Alerts are offering. So, which one comes out on top? Weirdly, if we're talking strictly gameplay, I honestly think that Red Alert Mobile is the most fun. I could do with another squad of units, but in general, shifting the focus away from Micro was really effective at making it more fun without sacrificing so much that it stops being a satisfying strategy game. Except that the controls are so terrible that playing the game is kind of a chore. The game with the best controls was definitely the iOS one, but those really needed a bigger touchscreen than what's available for that game to make them shine. On top of that, its pathfinding is terrible, it's abysmally short on content, and even getting to the point where you can actually run the game requires jumping through so many hoops that it's impossible to recommend. So if we're taking a holistic approach here, it's gotta be the original Red Alert. While I do think the gameplay of Red Alert Mobile is more fun for me personally, the original Red Alert is also simple compared to most RTSs I've played. Even without factoring in the expansions, it has tons of content for both the campaign and skirmishes, and at the end of the day, because there's so much open source shenanigans going on, it wouldn't even be that hard for somebody to make a good touchscreen implementation of its controls. On top of all of that, it has absolutely exquisite music that elevates the entire experience, which is a pretty stark contrast to the soundtracks of the 2 other games here, which made me want to tear my hair out. So what should these other games be called? Honestly, I think the name Red Alert Mobile can coexist with the name Red Alert totally fine, and I only included it in this matchup here because there's another different mobile game called Red Alert. However, these games are promotional tie-ins with Red Alert 3, and they're much more closely related to Red Alerts 2 and 3 than they are to the original. Red Alert 3 takes place on an alternate timeline from Red Alert 1 and 2, and these mobile games take place right before that timeline changes. That's why the Allies still have the Prism technology present in Red Alert 2, even though that tech doesn't exist in the Red Alert 3 timeline. A lot of the buildings also look like their counterparts in Red Alert 2 rather than 3, but then some of the units are straight out of Red Alert 3 like the Soviet Bears and the Allied Peacekeepers. Also, this Tanya looks like the one from Red Alert 3, not from 2, and Natasha doesn't even exist in 2. Anyway, my point is that these games are situated in kind of an interesting place in the Red Alert chronology. Should we pull a Lion King and call them Red Alert 2.5? Honestly, I first thought of that as a joke, but it's kinda grown on me. Red Alert 2.5 iOS and Red Alert 2.5 J2ME. Problem solved. I suppose now would be a good time to mention that there's actually a 4th game called Red Alert, or more specifically, Red Alert Online. I would have played it for you, except the game looks like this. As you can see, there are 2 big problems. First of all, I don't know any Chinese. And second, this looks like the worst kind of modern mobile game, and I would hate it within the first 30 seconds of trying it. So, snap judgment, they should have called it like Clash of Red Alerts, or Red Alertville, or King of Red Alert, or Red Alert Rivals, or World of Red Alert. Something like that. Just pick your favorite, I don't care, I'm not playing it. I do like their stand-in for Yuri from Red Alert 2, who looks like Mark Zuckerberg if he was only slightly more human. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time for Death and Taxes, now in Chrome. Let's see. Communists? Yeah, we got communists out the wazoo. I talked about this Big Apple, and originally I thought this game featured New York City, which would be another Big Apple, but I was mistaken. This is Moscow. What am I forgetting?
Ants?
Oh, right.
You just tell your men to get out there and kick some ass.